Well, Syria will no doubt be top of the agenda when the Arab League holds its summit in Baghdad next week. It's the first time in 20 years that Iraq has hosted the event, and while Iraqi politicians are keen to show their city and their country in a good light, there has been much fighting against their aims, including a deadly string of bombings earlier this week. Well, let's speak with Associate Professor Ahmad Shboul about this. He's now an honorary Associate Professor in the Department of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Sydney, and he joins me in the studio. Professor, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.
As a symbol of Iraq repairing as a nation, how much is riding on Iraq hosting this summit?
Very much. It's quite a lot. And I think one of the problems is with these bombings, you've got really two very complex messages. One is saying the current government cannot guarantee peace and security in the country. At the same time, there doesn't seem to be national unity because there are some parties, opposition parties within Iraq, who are not very happy about the way the country is going politically, economically, its foreign relations, as well as dependence on the Americans, its relations with Arab countries and with Iran and so on. And there's a suspicion, in fact, that maybe what is happening is, some people don't mind it happening, which leads to the second point, which is a message to the Arab countries that this is dangerous. So people who are behind this are hoping that at least some Arab countries will not go, or there will be a kind of attitude not to hold the conference at all.
Well, that's the hopes, perhaps, of those behind it, and an al-Qaeda affiliate has taken responsibility for this act. Is that likely to be the result? Indeed, how will both the Iraqi government respond to this? How will the summit delegates, the Arab League delegates, react to this?
Well, my understanding is that there have been quite a lot of negotiation between the Secretariat of the Arab League and the Iraqi government, and some representatives went and met with them at the security level to make sure that it's going to be secure in Baghdad for all these delegations to arrive.
This is before the bombings?
After. No, I
bombings?
believe yesterday, because the bombing was Tuesday. So after it. So it's, the government of Iraq wants to convince the Arab countries that everything is going to be all right and that they've got everything under control. But I think there's still great suspicions. But the other factor is the Syrian one. You see, the Iraqi government at the moment is hoping that President Assad or his representative would join the conference. There are some countries like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries who are not very keen on that. So it's one of the difficulties.
Before we talk a little more about Syria, which clearly is going to dominate talks there, Iraq's foreign minister has said that this summit is indeed a sign that Iraq had become a normal country again.
Yes.
Is the minister getting ahead of himself with a statement like that?
Well, let's say he's quite optimistic because, you see, as you said, Iraq has not had an opportunity to have this sort of conference. And also, in a sense, since Saddam Hussein disappeared, there has been conflicting attitude towards Iraq from different Arab countries. So they are trying to sort of be accepted in the fold again, because there are so many tensions, with Kuwait and, of course, with Syria and the other Arab countries. So it's really going to depend how they will convince the rest of the Arab world that they are going to be able to hold it. But if it does happen, I think there's going to be a great boost for the Iraqi government and Iraq in general. But it's really doubtful, quite honestly.
On the question of Syria, as you mentioned there before, now after this bombing, series of bombings in Iraq, the Syrian government has spoken up saying, well, those responsible for this in Iraq are the same ones who were responsible for the bombings in Damascus and elsewhere in Syria, yes, linking it to terrorists and terrorism. How do you think that will play in the summit and among the summit delegates as they discuss Syria?
Yeah, you see, the Syrians are saying that terrorists are coming from Iraq. And the Iraqis, actually, the Iraqi government is saying Syria is not working hard to prevent terrorists coming from Syria to Iraq. The implication is that these people are somehow associated with the Sunni opposition to both governments. Because you see, you have the Alawi regime in Syria, and you have an Iraqi government which is led by a Shia majority. So there is that kind of implication. And I think one interesting thing in Iraq is that, for example, the deposed deputy president, who is now sought for some trial, seems to be saying, look, it's not going to happen, it shouldn't happen. And it's as if he is happy about the violence that happened, although I don't think he's behind it. So I think Syria would like to sort of get more support to its stance by saying, look, this terrorism is affecting everybody. But also I think we need to think about, where different Arab countries stand in this. Because I think the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which seems to have a greater profile than its relative size, and then say Egypt, although Egypt is too busy with its own internal affairs, then Tunisia and Morocco and Algeria, they are sort of the great players. There are some small players like Jordan and Lebanon, but Jordan has a very crucial role, because if there is going to be interference in Syria approved by this summit, that's to say the Arab League in general, then Jordan is going to be crucial. And Jordan, because of its economic position, is hoping that if they cooperate with the Gulf Cooperation Council against Syria, that they will get more economic support. So it's quite, each country seems to be looking after its own interest, while at the same time pretending to be concerned about the pan-Arab cause.
In regard to that, given that there can't be, or hasn't been to date, agreement on how to approach Syria to try and bring about peace, given that the efforts so far to broker a peace have failed, the League's attempts, how do they approach that whole idea of bringing about resolution?
It's difficult. Look, let me tell you this, that I think the Arab League at the moment really is trailing behind the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly. So, and I think that's why they have this profile. Otherwise, nobody will be interested in them. So they are hoping that if the United Nations Security Council decide on something firm on Syria, then they can play a role. But otherwise, I don't think they can.
Professor, as you were mentioning there before, there's that interesting dynamic where not only with Syria, but obviously with everything on the table, yes, there's the domestic concerns plus the pan-Arab,
yes,
united concerns. Given that so much has happened since the last summit, there's been the Arab Spring, so there are going to be faces not turning up at that table. There are going to be new players not there at all with the overthrow of regimes. How will that all be considered? How does that work into what the League does and how the League stands?
I don't think the League is going to be talking very much about the Arab Spring, because the people in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, are not really happy about the Arab Spring, and they have been trying to sabotage it as far as I can see, especially Saudi Arabia and Egypt. The success of the Islamists to such a degree is really shocking. We've got more than 70% of the Egyptian parliament, and the general attitude in Egypt seemed to be really despair about this disappointment of the hopes after the Tahrir Square events and so on. Tunisia is sort of we are not quite clear. It's probably more hopeful than what is happening in Egypt. So I'm not quite sure that's going to worry them. I think the Syrian situation is going to be the main thing. And then general inter-Arab relations, attitude to Iran, I think, is another thing. And that's where Iraq is in quite a quandary, because on the one hand, there is sympathy with Iran because of the great Shia population in Iraq. But on the other hand, the government of Iraq doesn't want to appear as allying itself closely with Iran. And also they feel they are more Arab than they are Muslims, quite honestly.
Well, we began by saying how important is this summit for Iraq. How important, how historic could this summit prove to be for the League itself then?
From my knowledge of previous summits, I'm not very optimistic.
Right.
It really, if the United Nations efforts succeed in Syria, then the Arab League could claim some success. But otherwise, nothing much, quite honestly.
It'll be interesting to see next week when it's held. Ahmad Shboul from the University of Sydney, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us tonight.
Pleasure.